Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen.
آمين. نحن شعوب الأمم المتحدة، وقد آلينا إلى أنفسنا أن ننقذ الأجيال المقبلة من ويلات الحروب، وأن نؤكد من جديد إيماننا بالحقوق الأساسية للإنسان وبكرامة الفرد وقدره. وفي سبيل هذه الغايات اعتزمنا أن نأخذ أنفسنا بالتسامح وأن نعيش معا في سلام وحسن جوار. وأكد الإعلان العالمي لحقوق الإنسان، وكذلك أكدت عليه اليونسكو، أن لكل شخص الحق في حرية التفكير والضمير والدين، وأنه بدون سلام لا يمكن أن يكون هناك تنمية وديمقراطية. وأيضا اتخذت شخصيات عالمية من مبدأ التسامح واللا عنف أساسا لها في مطالبها وتحركاتها نحو التغيير والعدالة، مثل المهاتما غاندي ونيلسون مانديلا ومارتن لوثر كينغ. التسامح أو اللا عنف هو موضوع حلقتنا لهذا الأسبوع مع ضيفنا الأب القس ماركوس برايبريك، رئيس المؤتمر العالمي للأديان وعضو منتدى الديانات السماوية، الذي التقيناه في أحد كنائس لندن. أحييكم ولنبدأ معا حلقة اليوم. السلام عليكم أب ماركوس.
السلام عليكم.
أب ماركوس، التسامح قيمة إنسانية كبرى ومظهر من مظاهر تقدم المجتمعات. من هنا ما هو مفهوم التسامح، وهل هناك أنواع للتسامح؟
Yes, well, I think I would start from the principle that we're all created equal by God, and that's right at the beginning of the Bible. So in personal terms, tolerance, I would want to show respect and treat other people equally. I think for a tolerant society, again, everyone should have equal rights, equal opportunity. And I mean, give you one or two examples of how Britain has changed. I mean, we live very near Oxford, and up until the end of the 19th century, only people who belonged to the Church of England could get degrees at university. And then sort of after the Second World War, when we were having a lot of people coming from West Indies, some houses would have no blacks, and the society banned that. More recently, we've had the sort of issues of gender equality. So I think a society should give respect to, provide respect for people, or whatever their background.
التسامح أين يتجلى إذن في العلاقات الإنسانية، وما هي علاقة التسامح بالحريات والحقوق؟
Yes. I think rights I see in terms of law, but what we are allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. And clearly there has to be a balance between the right and the freedom. And I suppose one example of this is the laws about smoking. I mean, up until 20 years ago, people would smoke wherever they wanted to. And those who still smoke probably feel their freedom has been infringed, but others have a right to clean air. So I think that's the area there. I mean, tolerance I would think of more in terms of a personal behaviour. And you mentioned Martin Luther King, and I remember once hearing him speak when he came to London, and he was saying that the law can't make somebody love me, but it can stop them lynching me. And I would feel the tolerance is in that sort of personal area when we begin to, at least to move towards loving somebody else.
إذا كان التسامح مفتاح للتخلص من الخلافات، وهو شرط ضروري للسلام والتقدم الاجتماعي، ومن خلاله نستطيع التغلب إن صح التعبير على التعصب والتمييز والكراهية، فعلى هذا ما هي أبرز الآثار الجانبية التي يمكن أن تتحقق بالتسامح؟
Yes, I think well, the positive value of tolerance is that we overcome the enmity and hostility. People very often are afraid of those who are different. Perhaps they speak a different language, different religious beliefs. And going right back to when, the 16th century in Britain or 15th century, we were having people coming from Italy into the country. There was hostility, there was some question when a lot of immigrants from Russia came at the beginning of the 20th century. But what I think we need in a society is to ensure that everybody has equal opportunities. Now, of course, I think at the moment the discrimination is often in terms of money, that people have different wealth, but different societies have different levels of discrimination. But if you've got that, you've got the seeds for unrest, and very, very often then religion or religious differences will be used to inflame those other differences, sort of economic or so on, job opportunities.
هل يعتبر التسامح مبدأ من مبادئ حقوق الإنسان؟ وأين وكيف يتجلى هذا المبدأ؟
Well, it's built into the United Nations Charter, UNESCO, and I suppose it goes back to the French Revolution, a basic of American Constitution. Everyone has a right to liberty, freedom, happiness. And gradually, of course, I suppose in British history, it goes back from the beginning to Magna Carta, and gradually it's been extended. And it's really affirmed, I think, in all the religions. And at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1993, they adopted the global ethic, which was an attempt to summarize the moral teaching of the different religions and the issues we agreed on. And one of those is sort of basic rights of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and so on.
أب ماركوس، على ضوء هذا، ما هي إذن الآليات أو الأدوات والوسائل التي تساهم وتساعد أيضا في تحقيق التسامح؟
I think there are various ways in trying to achieve tolerance, and this has been part of the work of the various interfaith organisations. And I suppose the first is to try to remove prejudice and ignorance. I mean, there's a lot of, in terms of religion, a lot of Christians don't really appreciate very much about Islam and being prejudiced very often towards the Jewish people. We don't really know what other people believe. So I think there's a major task of education. And the World Congress of Faiths, which I belong in the sort of 1970s, began to campaign for teaching of all religions in our schools of this country, because people need to know what other people believe. But I think it's not primarily intellectual, and probably more important is encouraging people from different backgrounds to meet and get to know each other, and they really become friends. And I was told, I think, a rather interesting event in Israel, one of the peace groups there. They got 11 Jewish children, 11 Palestinian children together to play a football match. But when they got there, they found they had to be 5 Palestinians, 1 side with 6 Israelis, and 6 Palestinians. And 5. So instead of seeing each other as opponents, they were having to see them as partners playing together. And there's all sorts of ways in which music and other ways, I mean, just eating together. Because once you begin to build up that sort of human relationship, I think that transforms things. Now, clearly, you've got to have legal framework to stop people preaching race hatred, religious hatred, but it's for positive. Which I think, and I mean, we had one rather disturbing example in Northern Ireland. This was 20 years ago, and we had a big conference for teenagers, and it was really the first time most of the Catholics had ever actually spoken to a Protestant. Just that sense of barrier and division. So I think there's a whole range really of education and personal contact.
إذا ما تعمقت أكثر مع حضرتكم في مفهوم التسامح وحيثياته، يعني هل نستطيع أن نقول بأن هناك أشكال متعددة للتسامح وأين تبرز صوره؟
I think the basic sort of tolerance is just allowing other people to have their views, to behave in the way they like. My concern is really that we move beyond that. As often being said recently, tolerance is not enough, and to move to a sort of mutual appreciation. And I think this is important, say, in British society, but other societies where there are different faiths. Certainly, we want to have the freedom to practice our own religion. But if we're going to live in one society, we need to affirm the moral values that we share. We need to find the common ground. And the chief rabbis talked very interestingly about what he calls a community of communities. We have our sort of personal life. We may be in a particular community, but we belong to the wider community. And I think this means it's important to say the sort of symbols of public life are ones which affirm our unity. And of course that raises a question about next coronation when it happens. Will other faiths besides Christianity be represented at that ceremony? So there are all sorts of symbols in which we really begin to treat people as equal.
كيف يمكن إذن تحقيق التعايش السلمي بين أفراد المجتمع على اختلاف أديانهم ومذاهبهم ومعتقداتهم وحتى أعراقهم؟
Well, I suppose it goes back to what I was trying to say, but we really need to get to know each other. And the interfaith movement really has a long history. It goes back to 1893. There was a big gathering in Chicago, people of different religions. And gradually, more people have begun to meet, begun to appreciate that others have a genuine belief in God. And that, you know, whatever our ethnicity or sect or so on, I believe we're all responding to the one God. I mean, I still find some people think we worship different gods. And for me, there is only one God. So that's really been the aim, to help us understand. And I mean, as a Christian, I believe there is one God, and that the God Jesus showed is a God of love for all people. And so I think God seeks to reveal his will through the different traditions. Of course, the Quran speaks about every people having had their teacher or their messenger. So it is recognizing what we have in common.
أب ماركوس، إذا ما تحدثنا أكثر عن التسامح الديني، نود أن نعرف من حضرتكم ما هو المقصود بالتسامح الديني؟
Well, I think there are various levels of religious tolerance. I mean, well, for example, in what has been called a Christian country, if you think of it, there was some question, I think we got over it now, was it right, for example, to have mosques? And I remember the opposition in some cities about that people of a different religion in what I put in inverted commas a Christian country. I mean, I would have thought there are countries still which people can't have a church. So I would have thought a basic religious tolerance is that people should be able to worship in the way they like, and that with that goes the sort of ceremonies they like and so on. The tolerance about food, again, we had to have quite a campaign in Britain to get schools to serve vegetarian or cater for the different diets, or persuading hospitals to. So that sort of whole area. I think, as I say, we want to move really, so that every religion is respected. Well, I mean, say, besides the buildings, there are other questions arise about people's right at work, for example. Early on, for example, the Jewish community in Britain, well, they like to observe Saturday the Shabbat and not to work. Now, quite a lot of firms wouldn't allow Jewish people, this would go back to the 1920s or 30s. We still have a problem about religious festivals. So there's that sort of, in Britain we haven't got there, but there are other countries I've been to where there's very little tolerance, or some countries in the world where churches aren't allowed to be built. So it's that really recognizing that each group has their right to practice their religion in the way they think appropriate.
من وجهة نظرك يعني كيف يعد التسامح الديني أرضية أساسية لبناء مجتمع مدني ديمقراطي؟
Well, I think the two go together, really. But again, the basis of democracy should be that every person is equally valuable, and this is the idea of sort of having a vote, that each person's opinion is respected, and that, in one sense, the government is answerable to the people rather than exploiting or dominating the people. And so religion can help to, I think, have a critical role in societies where that power is being taken away. But it also encourages that mutual respect, because all too easily, if there's a prejudice against minority, if certain politicians appeal to that prejudice, then they're going to be, perhaps they can get votes by being anti-immigrants, for example, in some countries in Europe and so on, creating a certain prejudice. And I think it's then very important that the religious communities are seen to be acting together to teach that respect that everyone's valuable. And I remember several people saying to me when the Gulf War started, the thing that really helped them was seeing an imam, a rabbi, and a Christian priest praying together for peace. That the fact what goes on politically needn't disturb the sort of religious. And indeed, increasingly people of different faiths have to come together to protest and work for human rights. And I'll give you one other story which I always find very interesting, is from South Africa. There was this event when, this goes back to the days of apartheid, and there were some Christians and some Muslims, I think Hindus, probably Jewish, all together in protesting. And they were locked up in prison. And somebody said, what shall we do? And somebody said, well, why don't we recite verses from our scriptures? So there they were in prison, just sharing their understanding of God. So I think religion needs to have a critical role in society to proclaiming this whole idea of tolerance and civil rights, and being in one sense a guardian of people against governments which want to be too autocratic.
حوار الأديان أو حوار المذاهب، ماذا نقصد بحوار الأديان أو حوار المذاهب؟ وبرأيك لماذا يجب الاهتمام بهذا الموضوع؟
Well, I mean, certainly religion has a profound influence in the world, and I suppose we are aware that extremism often uses a religious label. And I think we've got to make very clear that no true religion uses violence for its own purposes. And it's been said that a crime in the name of God is a crime against God. So one of the things the interfaith movement is trying to do is to make very clear that religions are a force for good and for peace, although so often, if they're so co-opted into quarrels, which I think are often political or economic. But that also means we have to have the courage to tackle the extremists and try to break down that. But with that goes the whole need to give a fair representation of other religions, because all too easily, if it's a picture of conflict, we interpret that as representing religions. I mean, for example, we had that appalling case in America of some pastor burning the Quran. Well, it'd be absolutely tragic if that's what the majority of Muslims felt Christians thought about Islam, and the need to teach with respect. So it's the sort of negative, but also the positive. And then moving on to the positive, that we can affirm together the moral values that we share. And I mean, increasingly, faith communities are doing this in terms of campaigning sort of the environment, a real respect for the earth, a concern about poverty, and about trying to encourage the richer countries to a fairer pattern of trade, so to reduce poverty, trying to reduce illness. And of course, campaigning for human rights, for example, campaigning against torture and so on, and equal rights still in many countries, for gender for women and so on. Religion, besides trying to stop the quarrels, can be a real positive force for change. And one of the interesting things is that at the United Nations now, there's very much more interest in partnership with the faith communities. I mean, for a long time, because of the communists, they couldn't talk about religion. But I was at a meeting at the United Nations a couple of years ago, and it was really, well, at one point came over that something like more than half the health provision in the world and more than half the educational provision in the world is by faith-based communities. So if the United Nations is going to have a campaign about poverty and so on, they need to work with the faith-based communities. But the second thing I think is even more important, that the local faith community, the imam or the clergyman or the Hindu priest, they are involved in the local community and know what the local community wants. the World Bank, the United Nations, they're a long way away. So about working with the local population. And I mean, there's a very interesting example of that in one of the African countries, a sort of campaign to combat female genital circumcision. And the American Jewish body gave some local women who started the campaign some money. They then managed to persuade their imam, and the imam then went to tell other imams. This is Senegal, and then after about 5 years, the government banned the practice. So this, I think, the local interfaith communities of the whole world has a lot to do in practical concern. And then I think probably there's a third stage in the interfaith dialogue, when we actually come to see that we can learn and our own religious life is enriched by other people's. I mean, for me, I know by learning about Islam, it's deepened my Christianity because I've realized more about how wonderful and great God is. And for example, going in India to any of the mosques, the sort of greatness of the size, it's always that sense of holiness, so that we can move really to begin to understand each other and grow in our spiritual life. And of course, the Sufi teaching, as so many Christians have been enriched by readings of Rumi and so on, so that we can benefit. And of course, from the other way, I know Isa, Jesus, is respected in the Muslim world. So I hope we can move to that sort of partnership.
كنت قد ذكرت في مقدمة البرنامج بأن شخصيات عالمية مثل غاندي ونيلسون مانديلا ومارتن لوثر كينغ تحدثوا عن مبدأ التسامح والعنف. سؤالي هنا، هل تعتقد بأن العنف من كافة الأطراف، يعني على حد سواء كانت الحكومة أو حتى أفراد من المجتمع، هل سيكون بهذا جدوى والوصول لتحقيق المطالب؟
I mean, yes, I agree that violence is never effective, and I am committed to the way of non-violence, and the people you've mentioned are my heroes. Clearly, violence can be used to achieve objectives, but I think it's always in the end self-defeating, because in the long run, people will rise up and reject authoritarian rule. So it may have a limited success, but it's been said that no one wins a war. And obviously, I think religions have probably two particular values. One is trying to create a society which is peaceful and respectful. But I think they have a very particular role in what I call peace building after conflict, because you may be able to have a ceasefire. That's what you've then got to move on to, is getting communities which have been in conflict to live and work together to try to overcome and heal the wounds. And that's why I think Nelson Mandela's example is so important in trying to proclaim the message of reconciliation. Because so often when one side has somehow defeated the other, it then wants to seek vengeance or reparation and so on. And there's that book by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, No Future Without Forgiveness. Mm-hmm. And that's what, I mean, I think that's one of the things I'm very committed to, is the importance of forgiveness, of reconciliation. Mm-hmm. And you see what has happened, although we have a peace agreement in Northern Ireland, that the Protestant community and Roman Catholic community actually are now living almost completely apart. So there is that sort of peace, but there's not been the healing and coming together. And another area I've been much involved in is Israel-Palestine. There are many efforts to try to bring people together, because we need desperately a political solution. But we need even more for the people's attitudes to change. And one of the things I always find very moving is the bereaved parents, which you may know about, that some Israelis whose children in the army have been killed, mm-hmm. have got in touch with Palestinians whose children have been imprisoned or killed. And they have come together to campaign for peace and try to persuade governments that, you know, there's been too much killing already, we don't need any more. So, and I think we are seeing the power of non-violent protest. We're also very aware that some governments are ruthless in their attempt to suppress it, but I don't think in the long run they will.
إذا هل نفهم من حضرتكم بأنه يمكن الوصول للمطالب عن طريق التسامح ولا عنف؟
Yes, I mean it's costly, and I think well, if you think of the three people who mentioned, had to pay a very considerable price in their lives. But for nonviolence to be successful, we have to, I think, also become non-violent ourselves. And that's perhaps the most difficult thing, how we can still feel non-violent to people who are violent against us. And sometimes it seems to be the peace movement actually becomes quite militant. Because, well, thinking of Lincoln, but he was once sort of said, somebody, he was talking to somebody from the other side, and his members on his side came up and said, "Why are you talking to him?" He said, "Well, you make peace by making friends, and by having made a friend, that was the way to heal." So I do believe non-violence, it's very costly, of course. One sees that in the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, suffered from that abuse and so on, but he practiced forgiveness when Mecca came back to Mecca. So Jesus on the cross preaching forgiveness. So I think all our religions point to that forgiveness, and we're thinking from national terms, but it's also necessary in the community, in the neighbourhood. And of course, for all of us, it's easier to talk about forgiveness than to practice it.
في البحرين أعلن عدد من الشخصيات الدينية عن وثيقة للتسامح الديني والتعايش الاجتماعي، إلا أنه تم إقصاء شريحة كبيرة من المجتمع بسبب أو لأسباب سياسية ودينية أو ربما حتى مذهبية. تحت هذا الإطار، كيف يمكن أن يتحقق مفهوم التسامح والتعايش الاجتماعي؟
Yeah, I mean, I'm well aware of the problems of it going in Bahrain, though I'm no expert on the situation, but I've read the Amnesty report and aware of a little bit of what has been happening. I think what one would like to see is that the religious community, which is in the majority, really wants to extend and ensure tolerance is applied to everybody else. I mean, clearly there needs to be pressure on the government, but too easily a privileged faith community can want to hold on to their privilege at the expense of others, whereas in the end we should be committed even to those with whom we disagree doctrinally, but they too have the right to practice and believe. And I would hope faith communities and the leadership would take up the case of those who are suffering from abuse of human rights and really try to bring whatever pressure they can on the government. And I think there's also a call for the international community and the faith communities really to take an interest, because I'm very aware that sometimes you need international opinion to help put pressure on a local government. And I go to a completely different part of the world, but one example I know a little bit about, in Mexico, this was some 20 years ago, there's the Chiapas region, one of the remote regions, and the indigenous people were very much being suppressed by the international, multinational, industrial companies wanting to take the land, and there was a real lot of trouble. And we went to the village. The bishop there had been campaigning and trying to bring peace. And then, about 6 months later, we had this message from him that there had been a massacre in one of the villages, something like 45 people, mothers and children, being killed. And he invited us back for a service at the village when they were going to set up a memorial to those who had died. And I tried to travel with the bishop, and I meant he had to have an armed guard. And there was an army roadblock, and he thought they would find some reason to turn him back. But anyhow, we went to the village. But I think the fact that this was an international group, the Peace Council, we had been aware of what was happening, meant the Mexican government couldn't just hide it up. And this, of course, where the media has an enormous role to play in highlighting abuses wherever they're happening. Because at least some governments are still embarrassed and want to if it is highlighted and abuse is happening. And I suppose this very recent example from India of a woman who was raped, gang raped, and there's another one, is actually at last persuading the Indian government to actually put into practice the laws against the abuse of women, and perhaps will help to have a real educational campaign. So I hope the faith communities within Bahrain will do what they can, but I would hope the international community takes more interest. I think probably if interest is focused on Syria, more news. We don't hear enough about Bahrain. And of course, we have vested interests in the West, in Bahrain, and which may make us the governments rather quieter than I would wish they were.
هل يجوز ضمن مفهوم التسامح والتعددية الثقافية التضييق على الحريات الدينية وحرية المعتقدات أيضا؟
People are preaching racial hatred or religious hatred. I think there do need to be some limits. I mean, I would have wished, you know, we mentioned this American burning a copy of the Quran, that sort of thing. And I think in England we now have a law against religious hatred, stirring up religious hatred, and I think that's important. And the whole sort of way in which the Nazis exploited religious differences for their own purposes. But I would hope that they're very minimal and not to try and keep one religious group in power. So I think we do have to, but I think I would always be in favour of a maximum freedom and liberty. But what I wanted to add, and I really should have said before, is besides highlighting abuse, is I think the importance of praying for each other. And you know, nobody can work out the power of prayer, but perhaps I give two examples. There was 1 million minutes of prayer for peace. This was some years ago, and this was right at the height of the Cold War. And soon afterwards, Gorbachev and Reagan met for the first time. And I remember one politician being asked by a reporter, you know, how can you tell prayer worked? And he said, how can you tell it didn't? Yes. So, but I think that wave of prayer, and people have said how they've been supported. I mean, one of the Russian dissidents who was in Siberia for a long time said, from time to time, I felt this warmth, and I knew that people were praying for me. So it is a way of strength and a way of support, and really can affirm our unity and concern.
أب ماركوس، هل استهداف العقائد والشعائر الدينية يدخل أيضا ضمن هذا المفهوم؟
I suppose targeting raises this whole difficult question of mission, because most religions want to encourage people to become members of their religion. I mean, Christianity, there's a long history of mission. Islam would welcome more people to become Muslims and so on. And certainly in some countries, one thinks that some of the missionary movement and others have used sort of inducements, medical help and so on. And I would think any form of targeting is wrong. But I think equally, we ought to have respect for people, if they wish to, have the freedom to change their religion. And also a great deal of prejudice the pressure is brought on somebody who genuinely believes that they want to change. And I heard somebody once say that the sign of a mature faith community is if they're able to let somebody go. So I think both sides, we don't want unfair pressure and propaganda. And this, of course, is extremely important in schools and with young people, that the education doesn't indoctrinate them in that sense. They are allowed to discover their own personal faith. And even more so, it doesn't indoctrinate them with an anti-attitude to others.
لكل دين ومذهب وطائفة رموزه الدينية التي لها مكانتها بالتأكيد. يعني هل يجوز تحت أي ذريعة التجاوز والتعدي على قدسية هذه الرموز؟
Well, I'd be against any limit other than if there's very clear sort of health or safety risk. And I remember one service was in San Francisco. They were marking the anniversary of the signing of the United Nations Charter there, and there was a great big interfaith service in Grace Cathedral. And then there was a problem. One of the Sikhs couldn't get in because she had, well, he had, one of the symbols is a very small dagger. And of course the metal showed up on the, so we had a real business persuading the security people that it was a symbol and wasn't dangerous. But we've had this real problem recently in Britain about people, say, wearing a cross. One of the members of the British Airways, the European Court upheld the person wearing a small cross. But they didn't for somebody else who had a long dangling cross, who was a nurse, and they felt that could she could catch it on something, or that could be medically dangerous. I mean, I would have thought in most cases, in most of these cases, one could reach a reasonable agreement. But for answer, I certainly would defend the right of Muslims and others who wish to wear a veil or burqa in this country. And I think the French banning of this is wrong, because we need to respect, because if something is part of a person's faith, or even if sometimes it's not but part of their tradition, then there's no reason to object to. I mean, because the other sort of aspect of this is quite often governments will try to limit a person's freedom. There'll be harassment, all sorts of pressures will be brought on leaders of faith communities. And I know it's been happening, for example, in Bahrain with Ayatollah Qasim, but in other countries that will be that pressure. And I think it's even worse if a majority religious group are trying to exploit their position.
هناك بعض الخطابات الدينية التي تدعو من منابرها إلى الكراهية الدينية والتفرقة الطائفية والمذهبية، وتسمى بخطابات الكراهية. ما رأي حضرتكم بهذا النوع من الخطابات، وكيف يمكن للمجتمع أن يتغلب عليها، حيث أنها باتت تعرف بالخطابات التحريضية؟
Well, it seems to be clear if a particular religious group is trying to stir up hatred, or even more if they're legitimating or trying to legitimate the use of force or encouraging people to use force, then the civil society needs to take action. I suppose in our minds at the moment the hostage taking in Algeria, and if any religious group was trying to back up those who attacked the hostages, I think that they should, that should be, we should resist that and make clear that that killing is not in the name of God. But I think we have to move beyond that just sort of negative or the political or military action, really to try and look at what are the causes of why do people feel as they feel. And it's very interesting, after 9/11, the Episcopal Bishop of New York, or Primate, sort of a year on, reflected, and he says, we American people need to ask ourselves, why does anybody hate us as much as they do? It's not enough just to say, isn't that terrible what they're doing? We have to try to reflect on what is happening. And there are, I mean, I'm not in any sense wanting to justify that use of force, but there is economic imbalance. Are we, is the West trying to exploit the oil for the benefit? I mean, is what they're doing for the benefit of all the people in Algeria, or are they just taking that oil out of the country? And it's very interesting, Joe Berry, this goes back to a bombing of Brighton of the Conservative Party conference. Her father was killed in that bombing, but she went to Ireland to try, eventually met the person, to try and find out what was the problem. I mean, why? So it seems to me there's got to be a real concern to try and delegitimize those groups, because you will have a few extremists always, but they can, if there is prejudice about or inequality or injustice, they can draw on that to support their cause. So I think we need to make clear that religion doesn't tolerate violence, and all too often religions have in fact sort of half-tolerated violence, and we've got to do that. But we've also got to try to find out what are the causes, and sometimes there's an element of justice in people's protests, even if they wrongly use violence to try and gain that.
ما رأيك إذن بهدم المساجد وبيوت الله؟ يعني هل يعد هذا مظهرا مقبولا ويدعو للتسامح؟
Well, I think it seems to be totally against the principles of tolerance. Because again, one of the basic human rights is the freedom to worship and practice your religion. That means therefore the freedom to have a place where you can. And I mean, certainly in this country we've had problems about, initially when we were going to build local mosques, there was some local citizens protested, and with the interfaith group we campaigned very strongly that people should be allowed to have a place of worship. And I think, I mean, Bahrain and some other parts of the world, buildings being closed down, I still think it's a concern for Christians, but in some Muslim countries, in the Arab countries, we're not allowed to have a church or somewhere to worship. And I would hope that in any society, people are allowed to have their proper building. Now, I know sometimes there are difficulties because there are other sort of planning rules and so on, but we should really make sure that people do. And one of perhaps quite interesting stories, long ago in parish I was in down in the Medway Towns, this was in the 60s, a friend of mine, another priest, we discovered the only place the Sikh community could meet was in the back room of a pub. And of course, they're not too keen on alcohol anyhow. So we offered to let them use our church hall. And quite a lot of Christians were absolutely appalled. What were we doing helping another religion? But I'm still absolutely sure we were right, and more that would happen. So I think wherever this is happening, it needs to be condemned, and it's a sign that the government hasn't really accepted the United Nations Charter and what is implied in it.
أين يكمن مفهوم التسامح عندما يتم إغلاق المؤسسات والجمعيات الخيرية وتصادر أموالها بدون أي سبب واضح؟
Well, again, it seems to me defying the principle of tolerance. I mean, if, for example, a charity is being run for the purpose it's set out, and if there's embezzlement or dishonesty, then that's different. But then there has to be a very clear reason to challenge what's going on, and that's got to be made clear. And confiscating the money and so on, it just seems to me abuse. I mean, if governments do it, it's the same as stealing as if individuals took the money. So I would thought, I know it happens, but again, it seems to be defy all the sort of grounds of religious freedom.
كيف يكون دور الدولة في تعزيز مبادئ التسامح بكافة أشكاله وتفادي الأزمات التي تخلق العنف؟
I think the state probably has two roles. I mean, I think it's right to do by law to try and take action against people who stir up racial or religious hatred, want to destroy society and violence. But probably need much more positive action, because very often where there is religious hatred or intolerance, there are other underlying reasons. For example, I think when we had some problems with the community in Britain with Bradford, some of the young Muslims, they'd been discriminated against in schools. They were, because they'd grown up in Britain, they were in some sense alienated from the local mosque, which represented a sort of culture which hadn't adapted. And again, because their parents hadn't adapted to British society. So I feel we've got to try to remove, and of course, unemployment, poor housing, all these are other arguments why groups don't get on together. And first goes back, I think, really what we're saying right at the beginning. We want a society in which every person is treated equally, as equal respect under the law, equal opportunities. And if we don't have that, then we're going to have trouble. And of course, beyond that, countries where there's real poverty or countries where maybe it's oil rich, but the money is not going to the benefit of the actual people, some of the rulers in Africa who seem to enrich themselves rather than enriching their country. So all these are causes of underlying problems in society and then get exploited. And of course it's even worse if the rulers are exploiting it.
بالنسبة للإعلام، كيف يكون دور الإعلام في تفادي النعرات الطائفية والمذهبية التي تؤجج الكراهية؟
Well, I think the media will have a very important effect in both directions. I mean, if it is unbalanced or unfair or tends to sort of target a particular group, then obviously it can reinforce people's images and their prejudices. But very much more so, it can highlight abuse wherever it's going on. And I think very much we wouldn't know what was happening in many parts of the world without the media. And I gather something over 100 press or correspondents, radio, television, media people have been killed in Syria during the war there or the unrest. And if they weren't taking pictures of what was happening, we wouldn't know about the atrocities, the bad things that are happening. But I think the media has a very important role to play. It can be for good or bad. It can be used to discriminate, as I think can happen in Bahrain, against particular groups, but everybody's opinion's not allowed to be heard or so on. So it's used in many countries, and the communist countries did. This was state control of the media. On the other hand, where the media's got genuine freedom, it can alert the world to where abuse is happening, where there's need. It alerts the world to places of poverty where sort of action needs to be taken. And it can also be a major role in education, helping people to learn about and appreciate other people's faiths and real respect for them and for their culture. So the media, like everything, can be used for good, it can be used for harmful problems. And again, the basic freedom of the media is meant to be one of the things built into the human rights and into the Charter of the United Nations and so on. And wherever it's not free, it's merely a sign that the people in power are frightened.
الأب ماركوس برايبريك، في ختام اللقاء لا يسعني سوى أن أتقدم لحضرتك بجزيل الشكر. شكرا لك.
Thank you, Shukran, for asking me to take part in this program. And I would like to send a message, particularly to people of Bahrain, but anywhere where people are suffering from abuse, lack of freedom, lack of human rights. Certainly, we continually in our service in church pray for people who are suffering. And I hope we can do even more to alert our government to take some responsible action, and wherever we have any influence, to try to encourage that respect, and that people should be aware of abuses that are going on. Because if the international community turns a blind eye, abuse continues. We all have responsibility for each other, because we all together are children of God.
شكرا. أهلا وسهلا. مشاهدينا الكرام، في نهاية اللقاء استودعكم الله على أمل اللقاء بكم مجددا في حلقة جديدة وضيف جديد. إلى اللقاء.